Hospitals, the place where new life is brought into the world and where old souls depart, and everything in between. The horrors we have for you tonight are not for the faint of heart, so proceed with caution if you want to make it out. It's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. When I was 11, I became severely anorexic. The hospitals in town at the time tried everything, including feeding tubes in my nose, and nothing could get me to eat. So my parents heard about this hospital in Chicago, a 2-hour drive from where I lived, that had a good reputation and sent me there. For the next 3 weeks, I had continued to get worse and worse, and it got to the point where I was on the brink of organ failure, and I found out later that I was only a few days away. The doctors working with me were increasingly frustrated and almost seemed ready to give up on me. But one day, this doctor I'd never seen on the floor before shows up in my room. I was on the bed rest at the time due to how weak I was. It looked like a younger guy, like he was just starting out. He walked in, introduced himself as Dr. Dale, and sat down with a box of toys for me, and we just played and talked. The next 2 days are blurry now, but I distinctly recall going to the playroom. This was the children wards, obviously, and playing on the Nintendo and going for a little walk around the floor. Now, I wasn't actually supposed to do this, and one of the nurses actually called him out on it. But he sort of waved his hand, said it was fine, and we went on. The third day, he came back to my room with his hands behind his back, as if he were holding something, and said, "I've got a surprise for you." He had a rhinoceros plushie in his hands, as rhino is my favourite animal at the time. "I know it's your favourite, and I got it for you at the gift shop," he said. After that, and told me that he had a code blue to see to, and that I may not see him again. And I didn't. But I ate an apple that day, and slowly began to recover for the following weeks. When I was healthy enough to leave, my parents came and picked me up, and asked me where I got the plushie. I told them that Dr. Dale gave it to me. Now, being parents, and realizing that some strange guy apparently is giving gifts to their daughter, they obviously asked the staff who the guy was. Of course, no one knew what I or my parents were talking about. There was no Dr. Dale, and they didn't know where the plushies came from, and assumed it was from my parents, from home. As we were walking out, I had the presence of mind to check the gift shop to see if they had any other plushies. But they didn't, which could be a supply and demand thing, I guess. I made a full recovery, and I haven't had a full relapse since then, almost 20 years strong, and I still have the plushie. Now, as I grew up, I became very skeptical of my experience. Dr. Dale could have been an alias, but who does that? How could no one else have noticed him? And why did he just disappear? Why just me? There were others in the ward at the time too. It could have been a hunger-induced hallucination. Or I wouldn't have the plushie. I occasionally visit the hospital website and look for his name, but obviously I come up empty. I still have no idea what happened. I'm still trying to accept that something I just don't or will never understand happened, and it was for the better. I'm a paramedic, and I've responded to a ton of strange late-night calls, murders, suicides, pedestrian versus vehicle, car accidents, trauma, you name it. One of the most insane and sort of creepy calls I've ever been on was an esophageal varix bleed. These typically occur in alcoholics who have abused their esophaguses with years of alcohol contact, causing the vasculature to swell and become softer to the touch. Should a vein rupture, it's a slow, steady bleed, which will fill the stomach until the person literally begins projectile vomiting out their partially digested blood volume. They are often fatal. Anywho, we responded to a sick call, low priority typically. As we pulled into the patient's driveway, his wife was screaming from the front door. She was an elderly lady, literally screaming, "He's throwing up, help him." First thought, okay lady, you're definitely old enough to have seen more than one person projectile vomit in your life. Relax. We made our way into the house, up to the 3rd story of the house where the patient was, and as I turned the corner into the bedroom, I stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting bolt upright, pale as a ghost, this 70-ish-year-old man is covered in blood. Covered in blood. It started around his mouth and poured between his legs. His skin was ashen grey, and the blood had partially clotted from his mouth, down his throat, chest, abdomen, and into his lap. Huge clots. He was so very weak he could barely move. So he just reached a hand out to us and moaned, very much like a zombie. He also looked very much like a zombie, and it caught myself and my partner off guard. When we walked into the room, he must have been scared shitless, which we must have furthered by the look of shock on our faces and our eyes meeting his. He realized just how screwed he was that very second. We moved in pretty quickly after we realized what was happening, and each established a large bore IV to quickly get this guy some fluid volume back into his vasculature. Rule of thumb, 3 litres of 0.9 saltine only replace 1 litre of blood, due to the high of viscosity of blood. We ended up stabilizing the guy with a decent blood pressure, but when we got him to the hospital, he caught them off guard too. He coded once or twice in the ER, and I'm not sure if he ended up surviving the ordeal. About 30 years ago, I completed my international medicine training in upstate New York, which included a weekly outpatient clinic and ward rotations at the local VA hospital. I love military history and enjoyed the chance to talk with many World War II veterans back then, and even some World War I soldiers. These were everyday, working class, even humble men who quietly lived common lives, but had participated in some of the most storied and celebrated battles in the last century. They were part of a generation that made tremendous sacrifices and embodied many of our values that made America great. It was my privilege to hear some of the stories of this greatest generation firsthand. One man was in my clinic for over 2 years, so I was his primary care provider for some time. He was a tall, large man with a long white beard, and he always wore a Confederate cap. I always thought the hat reflected a bit of his gentleman's demeanour, with just a hint of rebel in him. He was a simple man who, although I was probably younger than his own kids, always treated me with respect, and he called me Doc, but never with my last name. We got to know each other quite well, as he was in severe chronic heart failure, so I was seeing him in my clinic on a very frequent basis to adjust his medications. One day, he told me his story about the war. It turned out he had served under Patton in North Africa. He described the scene of his last battle, and in my mind's eye I felt like I was there. He was on a high hill, and the Germans had overrun and nearly surrounded his position. Most of his company had been killed or retreated. From his position, he could see the enemy advancing on 3 sides. It was rock and gravel and sand, like the moon. There was dust, and the smell of gunpowder, and the smoke of burning diesel and oil. The Germans could not see his exact location, and so were firing indiscriminately upon the hill. On the other hand, from his vantage point, he could see the terrain well, and was systematically picking off enemy soldiers one at a time, with well-placed rifle shots. His own battle buddy was already down, but he thought still alive. It was only a matter of time before they were both dead or prisoners. Suddenly, the enemy stopped firing, and my friend knew that the Germans were sending a scout to ascertain his precise location and better target his position. He also knew he only had a few moments left, so he picked up his buddy in a fireman carry and started running away from the enemy's position. Had he not been carrying his friend, he would have been able to move much faster. He was nearly down over the crest of the hill that would have put him temporarily out of sight of gun range when he was knocked down. A bullet tore through his left shoulder and upper chest. He fell heavily to the ground with a gaping chest wound, and his friend rolled a short distance completely inert. It was only much later he would find out his body did not survive. His friend was bleeding heavily, but his next breath collapsed his lung, and much of the bleeding slowed. He lost consciousness and awoke in the dark. He wasn't able to get up, and drifted in and out of consciousness all night. The next day, he was picked up by American forces that had reclaimed the territory of the battlefield. His recovery was prolonged, but eventually he would recover, but he never fought in uniform again. He was awarded the Purple Heart, but other more prestigious medals of distinction would never come, because no one ever lived to testify about his heroism. He had not told this story to many people, he said, because he just never enjoyed talking about the war. It was my honor both to hear this story and to serve this true war hero. A lifetime of cigarettes and alcohol had taken a toll on him, as he fought other inner battles, not the kind of fights that were won with guns or violence. When I met him, he was also battling severe health problems. Miraculously, I was able to keep him out of the hospital for a fairly long time. However, eventually things fell apart, and he was admitted and started a downhill spiral. It was after midnight, and he had been in for a few weeks, and just not getting better. I visited him in the ICU, and he knew he only had a short time left. He thanked me for the care I had given him, and then started talking about the war. You know, Doc, I never regretted the things I did, nor those Germans I killed. I knew that if I didn't kill them, they would kill me. But lately in my dreams, I'm seeing the faces of those young German boys I killed. In his last battle, he was going back to his first. Death is the final enemy, and my friend knew he was going to the same place he sent the others to. He died that night. A man I will never forget. Thank you, friend. And also, thanks to all the others who have served, fought, killed, and even died for our safety and freedom. I worked as an agency nurse in a small country hospital for a while. We got a call from a nursing home saying one of their patients was going downhill. We went through all the motions, got the ER bed ready. The doctor was also waiting. The EMT pulls up, and they're actively doing chest compressions. The paramedic is breathing for him with an ambu bag or bag valve mask. The doctor asks why he wasn't intubated as the drive was around 30 minutes from the nursing home to the hospital. The paramedics just said, "You can try if you want, but he won't move his head." The doctor asks me to get a rolled up blanket to place under his shoulders. It makes it to where the doc can see the vocal cords so he can intubate the patient. I placed the blanket under his shoulders and his head is floating off the stretcher like he's doing a crunch or something. I applied pressure to his forehead to push his head down, but it didn't budge. I pushed hard enough to the point where I thought, any harder and I'm going to snap this guy's neck. Keep in mind, he flatlined this whole time, and we're continually having to give him breaths with the ambu bag in between all of this, but he's basically gone. The doc gets up, pushes down on his head, and hears a snap. The head goes limp. The doc pronounced the time of death, and it will be a sound I'll never forget. It was actually very close to the noise you hear in movies when someone breaks someone else's neck. The doc ordered an x-ray after it was all said and done, and his neck snapped at C4 to 5. A clean break. We called the nursing home to let them know he had passed. I asked the nurse to read me off his history. He had ankylosing spondylitis combined with a stroke. He didn't move or get out of bed. Laying still without movement for such a long period of time removed the flexibility in his neck and caused his cervical spine to basically fuse. When we applied pressure to his forehead, we snapped his neck. It's the worst feeling ever when you do more harm than good. This one comes from before I was a doctor, but there was a lady on the psych ward who had really severe postpartum depression and ended up killing her child. She wound up having a persistent psychosis state as a result and subsequently totaled out of it. Some douche therapist thought that giving her a baby doll would help her grieve and may fix things. Anyway, for the next couple of weeks she'd take care of the doll like it was real. I worked nights, and one of our responsibilities was to rotate the linens out for the patients. To do this, we had a big cabinet on wheels with locked swinging doors on the side. My buddy goes in to change out the linens, and when he opens the door, the baby doll swings out hanging by a sheet from its neck. It was easily one of the most unsettling things I've ever seen. I worked as the unit secretary for almost 2 years and asked to work weekend graveyards because it worked best with my school schedule. I saw a guy who got hit by a car going at 45 in a 25-mile zone while he was walking home from the library. Half of him went through the windshield before he flipped over the car and slid down the street. He was barely alive, but was a bloody pulp from his head to his stomach, and his face was gone. He died within a couple of minutes. I had a guy come in who was stabbed 9 times, but was so high and drunk, all he wanted to do was fight the cop who brought him in. He wouldn't quit yelling and spitting at him, or letting anybody touch him, so they couldn't find his records or get his blood type. They finally just sedated him and stabilized him before life-flighting him to another hospital. Anytime kids or babies die is absolutely brutal. I am a former ER nurse, and these are the 3 cases that come to mind when I think about my time in the ER. A gas line leak caused an explosion in a rural home. There was a family inside the house at the time of the explosions. After the explosion, The father was found trying to carry the kid to the nearest house to get help. The mother died instantly. The father and child made it to the emergency room, somehow alive and completely blackened with 100% burns. They did not live very long. It was unreal seeing breathing masses that did not resemble humans. Another incident. A very underage girl was taking an unrestrained joyride with a man, probably about 24 years old, in the middle of the night when he rolled the vehicle. They were doing CPR as they rolled her into the department. As they rolled her into the room, you could see an obvious deformity on her forehead. Upon further investigation, her brain was visible through her skull and was bulging with each compression. She was long gone, but when it's someone so young, you just keep trying. I'm just glad I was not there when the mother arrived. There's no nice way of saying this final one, but it was the worst smell I've ever smelt. A smell that made every seasoned ER nurse gag. A Mexican man was brought in, blacked out drunk, obviously ate lots of Mexican food and beer very frequently, and was shitting a deadly diarrhea with skinny jeans on and vomiting. It was bad enough that the other staff made me keep the door shut, even though that was against policy for a drunk person, and of course it was my patient. Lucky one nice nurse was brave enough to give me a hand and help me get his pants off. Not a sight or smell I shall ever forget. My great-grandmother and her two sisters were very close. In fact, they passed away in this same year and in the exact same order of birth. Aunt Mary, Grandma June, and Aunt Sally. Well, right before Aunt Sally died, we went to visit her in a nursing home. She was pretty far gone, having late-stage Alzheimer's, so she had been bedridden and unable to speak for the last 2 or 3 years. We did our usual visit of sitting and talking to her. We stayed about 2 hours and left. We get a call the next day from her nurse to tell us that she had passed in the night. But she told us something strange. She said she went to check on her around 1 in the morning, but as she got to the door, she heard my aunt saying, "Mary, do I look okay? What do you think, June? Am I ready?" But when she went in, Aunt Sally was still laying in the bed, but she had a soft smile on her face. The nurse came back 2 hours later, and she'd already passed. A 13-year-old boy came in for routine checkups and vaccines. At first, he was already acting like an angsty teenager, giving only one-word answers at first, and pouting whilst the mother was in the room. At this age, I ask parents to step out of the room to ask personal questions about sex, drugs, tobacco, and alcohol. But after, I asked, "Is there anything you want me to ask before I have your mum come in?" And his tone changed. He started to tear up and shudder, and talk about seeing a bloody shadow in his periphery, and that he has been hearing voices for 4 years. He always thought it was literally his subconscious, and everyone could physically hear their own voices. He only started to worry recently, when his best friend died in a car wreck. And now, the voices were yelling at him that he's stupid and that it's his fault and that he should kill himself. And then, he said, they were telling him to kill me. That they've been telling him to kill others for weeks. I didn't freak out, but I was thinking that I could not believe what I was hearing. I had a psych team see him immediately, and he was brought to a psych ward. The mother was shocked and had no idea. I saw him 2 months later, and he was a completely different kid. Sarcastic as shit, but funny and interactive and happy. It was like night and day after some medication. For whatever reason, this creeped me out the most, because I don't normally deal with psych. I've seen lots of post-mortem stuff dealing with trauma, so I've been desensitized to lots of things. But this event was the most surreal thing to me, mainly because it was so unexpected. The only other creepy thing was delivering a Cyclops baby. Mother was a healthy refugee from South America, just a little older than age 36, but had no prenatal care. It was more sad than creepy, because the mother wanted to hold him to say goodbye after failing to resuscitate. The baby's heart vessels were arse backwards, and his lungs were severely underdeveloped, according to the autopsy. I am a nurse, but saw this happen personally to a family member. My uncle had kidney failure, amongst other problems, such as DM. He had recently gotten a kidney transplant, say a few months before. 6 months later, he went to the ER with SOB, fever, and his sugars sky high. From all the meds he was on, his immunity levels were down. He ended up getting the H1N1 virus that made him very sick. They placed him in an induced coma to help get his sugars down and his kidneys working again. Fast forward 7 days, we get a call from my aunt that he isn't doing well. She meets with neurology, and they said that the only thing keeping him alive was the ventilator. He wasn't registering brainwaves. Apparently, during the night he went into the ER, his fever was too high, and it damaged his brain. Along with him being without enough oxygen during his sleep, this caused brain damage. We were all called to the hospital. There laid my uncle in the bed, still hooked up to the machine in the induced coma. She said to us, "I know he wouldn't want to live like this. I know my love would not want to be this way." She was pushing his hair through her fingers and crying. He's told me before. I looked over at him, and he opened his eyes and turned to look right at my aunt, like he looked into her soul. And a few tears fell from her eyes. She said, "See, I love you too, Pedro. He knows that I love him." That made us all cry like babies. She told the doctors and the nurses to turn him off the ventilator. I watched my uncle pass away, taking his last 3 breaths he would ever take in his life. Sometimes, I think you know he heard her. He knew she loved him, and he loved her so much. That's why he had to look at her one last time. I work in the ICU. I got a patient admitted from OR. A little old lady who was sitting around with her family. She stood up and fell backwards onto her oxygen tank, and it went up her vagina and perforated her colon. She got 21 centimeters of her colon removed and a cholecystectomy. I've seen some pretty messed up traumas and other stuff, but that is by far the cringiest thing I have come across. Another incident I witnessed was working in ED at the time. I had a little girl brought in for respiratory distress. Her airways closed, and they couldn't get any air in before she coded. Her parents were posting a picture of her lying lifeless on the table, not 20 minutes after the patient was pronounced dead, saying their little angel was gone. It made me despise social media. My brother is an EMT, and he told me this story. The patient is an obese male in excess of 500 pounds. 500 pounds. Unable to lift himself off the couch, and has been in that state for several weeks. They attempt to remove him from the couch, and a massive chunk of flesh begins to peel away from his body, exposing his muscles and his vertebrae. The patient loses consciousness. Unable to remove the man from the couch without killing him, they attempt to keep him alive whilst he is attached to the couch. The fire department is called, and they cut the couch away so that they can hopefully get him to the hospital intact. They managed to do just that. Now fast forward to the ER. The surgeon concluded that there was no way to remove him from the couch and save his life. Attempting to remove the couch would expose so much of his body to the outside that if he survived the surgery, he would not survive the infections to follow. The second story is an ambulance called for a homeless man who was complaining of severe foot pain. Upon trying to inspect the foot, it comes off. Just pulls away like an apple plucked from a tree, revealing the man's lower leg bones and a horrendous infection. He would survive, but not until he had his leg amputated at mid-thigh. I'd been working at an animal ER for 6.5 years as a clinical veterinarian. I can recount a few cases that make me sad to even think about. There was a Chihuahua that had its face ripped off through the fence by the German Shepherd next door. This poor little dog came in looking like skeletal, no muzzle anymore. That one was euthanized. There was this couple that bought in both of their cats because they both weren't really acting right. Old cats that had been together their whole lives and were very closely bonded, even cuddling in the room on the exam table. One had a huge tumour in her belly that was producing large quantities of fluid in her belly. The other one had raging acute pancreatitis. They put both of them down right there. Handing an owner an empty carrier is heartbreaking. Handing them two is unbearable. This was the first time I had to walk away and cry for a minute. Then there's the story of Sapphire, a 2-year-old pit bull that lived with a man who was not supposed to have dogs and was told numerous times by his landlord that he needed to get rid of the dog. One night, after a session of drinking, he decides if he can't have his dog, no one can, and proceeds to cut her throat with a kitchen knife. He cuts himself in the process. Police and emergency services are called, followed by animal control. Sapphire is brought with a gaping neck wound and a gently wagging tail. He missed her jugular, but severed most of her trachea. The doctor was able to sew the trachea back together, as well as the rest of her neck, and keep her under the animal control's budget. The owner was charged with felony animal cruelty, and Sapphire got a new home in a couple of months. Whenever I start to really question why I stay where I am, I think of Sapphire. When I was around 15, I had to get some volunteer time to look good for college applications down the road. My family has a bunch of doctors and nurses, so I was shuffled pretty quickly into volunteering at the Utah University Hospital. I was a flower girl Essentially, I trucked around the hospital and delivered flowers to patients. I believe it was on floor 5 at that point, but it was the psych ward. Often families wouldn't know why their loved ones were at the hospital if they were on the psych ward, so would send flowers. I don't think many of the patients were allowed them, because I had to deliver them to the front desk and not the rooms. I'd have to wait at the desk so the nurse could double check the patients there were. So a few weeks into working, I'm doing my rounds, and there's a lot of flowers for the psych ward this time. So I go and deliver and wait for the nurses to double check everything. As I'm waiting, this bearded old dude with the creepiest smile I've ever seen is wheeled in from somewhere else in the hospital, with an escort that has a gun. The patient looks directly at me and we lock eyes. He politely asks me if I know God before we lose eye contact. I turn around and the nurses, all pale as hell, rush me out of there as soon as possible. Found it weird until I saw his face again later that night on TV during the news. Dude was the guy who kidnapped Elizabeth Smart. And whilst I'm not the stereotypical platinum blonde Mormon girl, I'm a skinny Minnie with dirty blonde hair and blue eyes, so I'm sure he was more than happy to see me. I work in a large neonatal intensive care unit. We admit a lot of babies from our L&D and also pick up from any hospital within 150 miles. I've seen a lot of tiny babies, a lot of drug babies, a lot of abnormalities, like babies born with their intestines outside of their body. That being said, the worst thing I've ever seen was due to baby formula. Baby was born completely healthy. The mother was healthy. Everyone went home happy. The baby was admitted to us sometime later with multiple symptoms. After some questioning, it was discovered that the mum had been feeding the baby twice the amount of formula she was supposed to. I guess the mother couldn't read English very well, and when she asked someone to read the instructions of the formula, they gave her the wrong amount. So every feeding, baby was getting double the amount of nutrients and vitamins. This caused the baby to start feeling not so great, cry more often. And every time the baby cried, Mum assumed that they were hungry and would bottle feed the formula. The cycle continued until he was admitted. And sadly, at that point it was too late, and what should have been an otherwise healthy baby ended up passing away. Listening to the mother scream and howl, crying, "I killed my baby," is something I will never forget. My grandmother developed Alzheimer's around 9 years ago. For 4 years, my grandfather, who was healthy and a horse despite his diabetes, watched her. During the summer following his death, which was an accident, we hired a live-in nurse. She was a horrible person. She would eat the meals that Meals on Wheels would send and leave my grandma to go hungry. She'd leave her unattended to go to the movies, and she'd have her family come to my grandmother's home, eat her food, use her dishware, and just take advantage of everything. Well, it wasn't easy to notice this. We all worked 9 to 5 or were in school, so the nurse would just piss around during the day, until one day, when my grandmother, who at this moment didn't know where she was 24/7 and only knew my grandfather's name, who she would ask for constantly, she left her house at noonish when the nurse left her and climbed into my grandfather's pickup truck and drove to my aunt's house. Once she parked the car, she just sat there and slept. Luckily, my aunt got off for work early, before the nurse tried to do anything about it. When my aunt got up, my grandma told my aunt that my grandfather, Jeff, said that the Canterbury Centre of Rehab just reopened. We investigated the nurse and had her fired and called EPS. Now, I didn't think too much about what she said. We wrote it all off as confused lucidity until her passing. She died 2 years ago today, and she was wearing a neck brace that had a cast on it from a fall which determined she could no longer walk. She only made sounds that were no similar to words. I watched her die as she took her last breath. She reached up towards the ceiling and said clear as breath, "I'm coming." The creepiest thing was that whatever was affecting her, would give her these moments of clarity. She knew she was being neglected in a situation where she didn't even know she had to potty. She knew my grandfather and knew he was gone, and she knew she was dying. My mum, a religious nut, is convinced that my grandfather was protecting her from heaven. I don't know. I just know what I saw and felt. I didn't feel good about it though, like everyone else did. I felt sick to my stomach. It's weird, but you know the feeling of being watched. It was like that feeling. The little hairs on the back of your neck stand up, and your senses start to peak. I am a surgeon, and I saw hardened trauma nurses leaving an operation room, looking grim and a bit green. I went in to see what the fuss was about. A homeless man was attacked by Rottweilers, incapacitated, and they proceeded to eat all the flesh from both legs and one arm as he lay there helpless. Don't ask me how he lived, but he survived that, and ultimately lived long enough to leave the hospital. I will be haunted by the look of his leg bones, intact, with no flesh on them. The arm was gone. He still had the interosus tendon holding the tibia to the fibula. I suppose it's hard to eat, but otherwise, just intact leg bones, completely free of flesh. The feet, of course, were gone. My mother told me a story when I was young about my great-grandfather often going to a bar when he was young, and it became regular for him. Where we live in Maine, and seeing as he was a World War II veteran, can't rightly say I blame him, especially since he was a medic. But I will say, in returning to the story, that at a certain period in the time, a man would often join him for drinks at the bar, and they became well acquainted. Having never met the man outside the bar prior to the several days that he would sit and chat with him, he told us that he seemed like such a nice man, until one night he entered the bar and he seemed different according to what I can remember, and they talked for a bit, but the man was anxious to leave. My grandfather left the bar, and about an hour and a half later, discovered a large amount of police officers at the hospital whilst he was driving past, to which he paid no attention to. But after arriving home, the very same man who he had been drinking with was in the news, wanted in connections to several murders at the hospital of registered nurses after hours. My then girlfriend and I were in a pretty severe car accident. We both had concussions and whatnot. It was crazy. While we were there, which was at least a few hours, I saw what must have been a homeless brawl gone horribly wrong. One of the guys literally had broken a beer bottle and lodged it into the side of his skull, and was very badly cut all over. It was hard to grasp the whole situation, because his whole head and face was covered in blood and he was screaming. It took several police officers to hold him down, while the doctors gave him what I assume were sedatives. The other homeless guy came in another ambulance in a few minutes, with 2 gunshot wounds, but I didn't see much of him. But I knew he was alive because he was babbling incoherently as he was carted by. Anyway, this is probably business as usual for the ER, but none of my other visits to the ER in my life were anywhere near as drastic as these ones. I hope they both made it out okay. I am an ER vet nurse. We've got the advantage over human medical staff of being able to euthanize in terminal cases, or where we can't afford to treat. I am very grateful for that ability. I can't imagine working somewhere where the ability to give that final mercy would be taken away because sometimes it is absolutely necessary. Sometimes there are things we can do, but the question has to be whether we should do them for the animal's sake. Some of my worst cases that I've ever had to nurse are ones where the animal should have been euthanized, but we've been unable to get the owner's permissions. For example, a 6-month-old Rottweiler puppy that gave itself grape toxicity at 3 months and ruined most of its kidneys pulled through that episode by a hair's breadth, after weeks in hospital on fluids. It was allowed to get into grapes again, gave itself acute on chronic renal failure, and bloods indicated renal values off the charts, even with dilution. Basically, meant total kidney failure. Short of hemodialysis and new kidneys, this dog was already dead. It just hadn't actually died yet. Owner point blank refused to euthanize, even after multiple vets explained that their dog had a 0% chance of survival, and its remaining time would be in the hospital cage, surrounded by strangers, suffering extreme nausea and crippling pain until it died. They still refused. We drugged it up to its eyeballs and spent 2 days watching it die. I'm glad I never had to interact with the owners, because I have never wanted to punch someone more than I wanted to punch them. There was also a cat in such severe respiratory distress that it needed to stay in the same position and take 16 gasps for breath per minute, or it would suffocate, even on 50% oxygen. I had to watch it for nearly 10 hours of a 12-hour shift. Poor girl had to pee where she sat, because moving took too much effort. Couldn't eat, drink, sleep, couldn't even lay down. It took another 16 hours or so of the same, and us trying every treatment we could think of, with no success, before I snapped and told the vet that we had to speak with the owners again about quality of life, because I couldn't sit there and watch the cat fatigue its way to respiratory failure overnight. The final story was a dog that had eaten slug bait and was having non-stop seizure activity for 30 minutes before it arrived. Non-stop seizures basically cook the body from the inside, as well as causing hypoxic brain damage. The dog was 42 degrees when it arrived to us, and probably had been there for over 5 minutes, so chance of functional survival were extremely slim. The owners wanted to give it time. Fair enough, it's a shock, we get it. But the dog went downhill, and nothing we could do was helping. We were just throwing their money at a dead dog at this point, and they turned off their phones. I spent 12 hours sitting with that dog, watching it shit out its gastric lining, which, for the record, looks like period chunks and smells like death. Watching it unconsciously vomit up cups of slug bait, putting it on a ventilator, because they said that they wanted all measures taken when we could contact them. Knowing everything I did was futile. They euthanized it 3 hours after my shift finished, when we could finally contact them again. But I still can't look at that bright slug-bait turquoise blue without feeling sick. I don't want to finish this episode on a bad note, so let's finish with some positive stories. We had a working dog come in for chronic respiratory problems, and imaging was just not giving us enough information. Something was iffy with his right lung, and there was air around it. So he went to surgery to figure out what was going on, and we found a massive hole in his lung, like an inch long, just freely leaking air into the chest. Being a working dog on a farm, they're worth a fair bit, but we needed to take out the entire lung, and chances of him going back to work were slim. Fully expecting them to call it on the table. Nope, we do the surgery. So we did. Out comes the lung. We wake him up hoping he can breathe well. We wake him up with a 40% reduced lung space. He's doing super well on supportive oxygen, and the next day was back on room air. He continued to make a fantastic recovery. No complications, and I hear he potters about his farm doing little jobs every now and then, and getting spoiled rotten in between. We also had a cat come in, whose owner insisted that something was wrong, even though he was showing really vague signs. After a bunch of diagnostics, we unfortunately diagnosed cancer, but we caught it ridiculously early because his owner was so astute, and she was willing to go for chemotherapy too. Chemo in animals is all about patient comfort, so we use lower doses and make sure they're not nauseous or in pain during, and he's doing really well. He boards with us every so often when his mum goes away, and it's a year out from diagnosis now. Everything is still under control, without her being so onto it, and without being able to do the diagnostics, he wouldn't be here in reasonable health. We also have a few miracle dogs that have survived major injuries through dog attacks. The biggest one was a little Griffon Affenpinscher cross. Looks a bit like an Ewok, but like 4 kilograms. Spent about 6 weeks in the hospital with us after a bigger dog grabbed her by the chest, broke some ribs, and punctured her lung. Nearly killed her outright, but she pulled through. Then she got wound infections and had to have more surgeries. Started off as this horrid dog that tried to bite us for anything, but by the end of her time, she was letting us all do full bandage changes and wagging her tail. Her owners used to come by with a full picnic basket and take her out for a few hours for a picnic in the dog walking area. They lived 3 hours away, but did that every weekend without fail, and she made a full recovery. Her bill would have been thousands, but there was no doubt in these owners' minds that they would do whatever it took to help her recover. The little dog went home, and they send us cards every so often. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. Huge respect to all of those who work in the medical profession. Your work is invaluable, and I could never endure the things you must go through day to day. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to give it a big thumbs up, and consider subscribing for even more stories every day. Don't forget that if you'd like me to read your story on my channel, feel free to send it to my email or share it to my Reddit, which is of course available in the description. Please make sure to include as much punctuation and descriptive language as possible in your story, and paragraphing, to maximize the chances of it being read. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.